There's a story, and I think it's true, although it may be apocryphal, that my predecessor once gave a Christmas party for his clergy. And the night of the Christmas party, nobody showed up. And so, to say the least, he was not happy with his priests and deacons of the diocese for not coming to his Christmas party, and told us so. What we discovered later on was, as the clergy talked among themselves and said, "Why didn't you go to his party?" And the other one said, "I didn't know about it." The bishop gave a party. Nobody came because he forgot to send out invitations. Or else they were sitting on the floor in his office somewhere and somebody else forgot to send them out. The king in Jesus' parable this morning has a wedding feast planned for his son. And he invites all of his invited guests to come to the wedding feast and be part of it and to share in this joyful experience. And in those days, wedding feasts were put on by the groom's family, not the bride's as we have it now. And it went on for several days, depending on the wealth of the family. And so for days after days after days, people gathered and celebrated and danced and sang and ate and drank and just had a great time. But now, in this instance, nobody shows up. And it's the king. The king invites them and nobody shows up. And so the king sends his messengers again to invite people. He said, "Come to the wedding feast." And they just kind of, ignore the messengers. Some of them they even roughed up and killed. But one of them says, "I have a business to attend to," and the other one says, "I have to go to the farm," and whatever. But they didn't want to come to the wedding feast. Now you and I might think, that'd be like being invited to the White House and saying, "Sorry, I've got to clean the basement this weekend. So I just can't come to your dinner." Now, I don't think the president would send the CIA or somebody to get us, but it's like rejecting that kind of offer, and this is what these people did. And so then, when nobody shows up, the king sends his servants out into the streets where he lives to bring in anybody they can find. Now, the story Jesus is telling is again, like a couple of weeks ago, an allegory. Not really a parable, but it's an allegory, where things kind of mean something else, and we can stretch it a little bit. And the kingdom that Jesus is talking about is the banquet, the heavenly banquet that people are invited to. And in the story, Jesus is telling this in that interim between the triumphal entry and Good Friday. So he's in Jerusalem, confronting the religious leaders, and they kind of figure out, I think he's talking about us. That we were the ones that were called to the banquet, and we haven't lived into that call. We haven't fulfilled what God has expected to us. So maybe what Jesus is saying is they're going to bring someone else into the banquet. Now, Matthew tells this story to his worshiping community, wherever he might have been at that time. And there was always tension in the early church between Hellenized Jews and Greek-speaking and Hebrew-speaking Jews. And there was always that tension that went on between them about who was better than the other. And so we wonder if this early Christian community wasn't struggling with who's in and who's out. And maybe they told this parable to remind people that all have been invited. And if you don't show up, it's your own fault. So the king gives the feast and invites everybody in the street. And everybody in the street comes. And then the king comes into the feast and he's looking around and he's looking at people. And finally there's somebody there without a wedding garment. Now this is where the story gets a little confusing for us. We think, all right, if these people were brought in from the street, how did this poor guy know he needed a wedding garment? And how would he afford to have a wedding garment? And what did wedding garments look like in the first century? What did they cost? Did they have him laying around? And it's not really his fault, is it, that he wasn't appropriately dressed? And we argue over this back and forth in our exegesis of this parable. To go back to remember, it's an allegory. It means something else. It means we have been invited to a banquet. We have been invited to a heavenly feast. We come and we participate in that feast every week. We call it the Eucharist. What we do here is a reflection of what goes on at the heavenly banquet in heaven. We're all part of that great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us, the angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. But what is that wedding garment we're supposed to have? Why is that man rejected because he's not appropriately dressed? I remember when we moved from Lexington, Kentucky to Cincinnati, which is only a space of about 100 miles. The problem being Lexington is culturally in the deep south and Cincinnati is in the north. And taking our southern culture north with us, for the first 6 months, every place we went, we were overdressed. And so what we see in this story is this man forgot to bring his wedding garment. I think the question is, we bring this back down to our level. What do you wear to the banquet? What do you wear, if you will, to church on Sunday? What does your wedding garment look like? Now, it's not the fact that you dress up in your best suit or whatever it is, although we used to do that. And I remember when the ladies all came to church with hats and gloves, and God forbid they should wear pants or something like that. I remember the first woman in my church who wore slacks on Sunday morning, and that was a real ruckus. But nowadays, we look around, people show up wearing everything. You go to formal weddings, and the only formal people there are the bride and groom. People wear anything to funerals these days. So what is the appropriate dress that Jesus is talking about? What is the wedding garment? Well, the wedding garment for the banquet is not what you wear to it, but what you bring to it inwardly. How do we come and present ourselves at this banquet? Do we come ready for what's going to happen? The Episcopal Church, or the Anglican Church in general, if we weren't looking for its theology, you have to find it in the prayer book. So let me read to you about wedding garments for this banquet. Talking about the Eucharist. But if we are to share rightly in the celebration of those holy mysteries and be nourished with that spiritual food, we must remember the dignity of that holy sacrament. Therefore, I call upon you to consider how St. Paul exhorts all persons to prepare themselves faithfully before eating of the bread and drinking of the cup. For as the benefit is great, if with penitent hearts and living faith we receive the Holy Sacrament, so is the danger great if we receive it improperly, not recognizing the Lord's body. Judge yourselves, therefore, lest you be judged by the Lord. Examine your lives and conduct by the rule of God's commandments, that you may perceive wherein you have offended in what you have done or left undone, whether in thought, word, or deed. The banquet Jesus is talking about is what we participate in every Sunday. The wedding garment you wear is what you bring inwardly to this. Do you come prepared to greet the risen Lord in the Eucharist? Do you come with a penitent heart? Do you come with a sense of forgiveness? Do you come with a willingness to change and be transformed by encountering Christ in the sacrament? If you don't, then maybe you should think about it a little more. Maybe you should step back and think, am I ready for this? Am I doing, as St. Paul says, worthily as I should? I don't know that the King will throw us out if we're not here with the right garment on. That is something that happens at some other point. But I think we need to remember what we wear to this and what we bring to this celebration and this party. We need to come prepared and dressed, at least inwardly, to meet the King and be part of that banquet. It's not my role to judge anyone. I don't know where anybody is in their life walk and with God. That happens some other time. But I think each of us, each Sunday or each Wednesday or any time we come into a worship experience, need to ask ourselves, are we ready for this? Have we put on the right garments of faith and repentance? That's why it's always been the tradition in the church for people to come early, to come into the chapel or the church early a few minutes and kneel down in prayer and get yourself focused on what's going on. To maybe have this conversation with God to say, am I ready for this? Am I prepared for what's going to happen? Am I opening my heart to receive Christ in the Eucharist? It's an answer you have to come to on your own. But it's something we need to do at every service, to come and make ourselves ready and prepared. So next time you come, don't leave your wedding garment at home. Bring it with you. Put it on when you come in here. Make sure you're appropriately dressed to meet the King in the banquet. Remember, it's a party, but you do have to dress for it. You know, now the invitation may say business casual, but wear your wedding garment when you come. And you've all got one. And if it's at home in the closet, next week get it out and bring it with you.